Welcome to Rachel Engstrand's defense. It's a real pleasure to be able to introduce her today. Just a brief history of her academic background, I think, is in order. So I'll just do that, and then Rachel will take it away. Rachel has a bachelor's degree in biology from NYU, earned in 2010. She has a master's in evolutionary biology from the Erasmus Mundus Master's Program, which is a program that combines three universities, Harvard, Montpellier, and Groningen. And she got that master's degree in 2013. After that, she worked in research at the American Museum of Natural History, as well as at a place in the Peruvian Amazon called the Villa Carmen Biological Station. And from what I know, that's where she picked up the trail that has led her to this dissertation on gold mining in the Amazon basin. Rachel joined us at Stanford in 2015 as an E-IPER graduate student, obviously. And during the time that she's been with us, she has looked at this gold mining problem that you're going to hear about today from a wide range of scales. Probably the dissertation spans the biggest range of scales I can think of, from microbial to large scale regional analysis using satellites. And so it's a really exciting dissertation that brings into view under the lens of multiple different ways of understanding gold mining. The title of her dissertation, as presented today, is The Human and Environmental Dynamics of Artisanal Small-Scale Gold Mining in the Peruvian Amazon. So with that, Rachel, take it away.
Hi, everyone. So thank you, Greg, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you all for coming here today. I'm really excited to present my dissertation research to you, which is, as Greg said, on the human and environmental dynamics of artisanal and small-scale gold mining in the Peruvian Amazon. So our story begins in the southeastern region of the Peruvian Amazon in a department known as Madre de Dios. This region contains 66 million hectares of tropical forest, which hosts some of the highest terrestrial biodiversity and above-ground carbon stocks in the world. Due to its diversity and the important local and global ecosystem services it provides, it is considered a high conservation priority. However, in addition to this biodiversity, this region also contains a lot of gold, and the gold has been mined using artisanal techniques since at least the 1930s, when the first known gold rush in Madre de Dios occurred, following the construction of this interoceanic highway in the 1980s, which you can see crossing the region as this red line. Following this, there was a massive increase of immigration, which has allowed for gold mining to grow exponentially in this region, as every subsequent boom in gold prices leads to another boom in gold mining. So at this point, you might be asking yourself, what is artisanal small-scale gold mining? It's artisanal, it's small, it sounds kind of nice, maybe like a hipster coffee shop, but they sell gold. However, this is not the case. This activity is defined as miners operating illicitly without paying taxes, holding permits or land titles, and without environmental impact analysis. They are not officially employed by a company, but rather work independently using their own resources. The processes of this type of mining include clearing standing vegetation through slash and burn techniques to gain access to the soil. Miners then work down beneath the topsoil into the gold-containing mineral soil layer and use suction pumps which suck up this mineral soil mixed with water and transport it into these sluice boxes. The sluice box captures silt and clay as well as gold particles and lets sand and water pass through the other end. Miners then mix mercury into this captured soil to separate out the gold particles by creating a gold-mercury amalgam. They then burn this amalgam to recover the gold. And while this activity is, by definition, small scale, when you have tens of thousands of small-scale miners working in unison, It can have the potential to transform landscapes, turning what was once a verdant forest into a highly degraded and contaminated ecosystem. Today, gold mining is the leading source of deforestation in this region, and it has been found that more than 44 square kilometers of forest are being cleared each year for mining. As it's grown so intensely in recent decades, it has also led to a rise in social and ecological issues in this region. So at this point, you're probably thinking, gold mining should be stopped. And you wouldn't be the first to think that. But in the past, when military and police interventions tried to stop mining, they have largely failed. So if mining isn't going anywhere, how can we make it better? Luckily, there are local NGOs working to help create that better future. One of these NGOs, called Cincia, has been working with miners in this area for years and working with government agencies to try and help answer this question. I have been lucky enough to work with Cincia, and so for my PhD research, I wanted to try and contribute to this local goal of creating a solution that can be sustained such that miners can still benefit while minimizing negative impacts on people and the environment. And I wanted to learn more about what this mining system was. So to do so, I identified 3 steps that I can take to better understand how this complex social and ecological system works and hopefully contribute to improving it. We have to listen to what is the local context in which this activity is taking place beyond what the headlines are showing us, and what are the local perspectives on the future of gold mining. We have to look and see how often is mining occurring and where, what factors influence these spatial and temporal dynamics, and then we can learn what are the environmental impacts of these mining methods. Can gold mines recover naturally, or do they require human intervention? So I like to think of this as 3 interlinked pieces that influence one another. The local context of the people who are mining and being affected by mining, the spatial context of how gold mining activity varies over space and time, and finally, the ecological context of how gold mines can recover once the miners abandon them. And these 3 pieces represent the bulk of my dissertation research that I'm going to present to you today. First, let's talk a little bit about the local perspectives that we learned by speaking with people living in or near gold mining areas. We spoke with various stakeholders, from people actively engaging in gold mining to people working in agriculture, conservation policy, and tourism. Our goal here was to learn a little bit about their stories and their perspective on gold mining so we could understand a little bit more about the social context in which our study takes place. And we also wanted to hear what some of the local perspectives were on our research questions and what their own hypotheses were. And then, of course, we also wanted to learn about what methods miners were practicing so that we could inform our ecology and spatial studies. Particularly, we also wanted to ask miners and mining communities, please, please, pretty please, can we visit your mines to study them? So the biggest thing that we learned is that mining cannot be left behind. It is part of the people who like to work. We hear time and time again from every person we speak to that mining has existed in this area for decades. It is part of their history, and command and control to eliminate it will not work. And this is largely because while gold mining has a host of social and economic impacts in this region, they are not all negative. Nearly every person we spoke to mentioned that mining does not just benefit the miners and their families, it benefits the region broadly by supporting other industries such as agriculture and hospitality. In fact, this region of Peru has the lowest rates of economic poverty in the entirety of Peru. And though locals are aware of the health effects of mining with mercury, we find that there is a mixed belief in these impacts, particularly among the miners and farmers that we spoke to. This is illustrated here with this miner who says that with the mining, we have educated our children and we have become professionals. These are the consequences of mining. We have not gotten sick from mining and working with mercury. There is no one who is sick. Many of the miners and others we spoke to also believe that the environmental impacts are overstated. We heard many stories of natural recovery happening on mines, despite those we spoke to working in conservation and research saying that they did not believe that there could be much, if any, natural recovery. When we speak with locals more about the negative impacts of mining, everyone from miners to farmers agrees that they are plentiful. But what many also say is that they attribute these negative impacts largely to the ineffectual legislation that made mining in its current form illegal, while providing no alternative. This sentiment can be seen in this quote from a local gold merchant who says, "Mining here used to be legal, but since the rise of environmentalism, the government laws are making it illegal and informal. Now, if people want to work, they have to work illegally. Now there is more corruption and more crime." Many also cite widespread corruption in government and police, which keeps illegal mining operating and allows it to circumvent control efforts. With regards to our spatial study, we learn from these conversations that while there are two main methods practiced here, both of these methods are widely believed to be inefficient. Many believe that they can recover less than a quarter to a half of the gold contained within the soil. So miners will have to mine the same site over and over again to capture remnant gold. Likewise, we learn that since these miners don't have geologists scouting new locations for them to mine, they often revisit an older mined area since that is less risky than starting a new mine and finding nothing. Or they will work near areas that others are working with the hopes that that indicates that those areas have gold. Now, for our ecological study, we learn a bit more about how these methods differ in practice. Both of these methods generally follow this same artisanal mining practice we described. Heavily mechanized methods do so with the assistance of heavy machinery, which, as you can imagine, is far more expensive than the hand tools and suction pumps required for minimally mechanized mines. These two methods of mining lead to a drastically different mine topography when they're finished, where heavily mechanized sites are typically dominated with more and larger excavation ponds than minimally mechanized sites due to the larger amounts of earth they're able to practice. Interestingly, though, we also learned from miners using heavy machinery that they have the option to practice basic remediation on a mine before they abandon it. Although this is not frequently done, these miners can choose to level the topography of a mine before they abandon it and even return fresh topsoil, which many believe is better for the environment and can help it recover better. When we spoke with interviewees about barriers that exist that prevent miners from investing in more sustainable methods, for example, purchasing heavy equipment that might allow them to remediate the land, or using a shaking table that can separate gold from soil without using mercury, most believed that corrupt policing and uncertain legal status were a barrier for miners to adopt more sustainable methods, as illustrated in this quote, that there is no way. The miners are too afraid that at any moment the police will come, so they do not invest thousands of dollars. Many cited that practicing these more expensive but more efficient and sustainable methods were only possible for mining communities that have the rights to their land, such as Indigenous communities that mine on their own territories. And indeed, every Indigenous community we visited did practice some form of remediation. So, what have we learned? Gold mining is a part of the local history and culture, and it brings many social and economic benefits in addition to its issues, and improvements are complicated by legal status. And since what we've learned here is inherently linked to our spatial and ecology studies, let's review what we've learned there as well. For our spatial study, we learned that mining is a repeated activity due to inefficient methods, and the intensity of mining activity will likely depend on multiple factors. For our ecological study, we learned that there's a mixed belief of the natural recovery potential for mines, and that differences in mining method can lead to differences in disturbance, but also in remediation methods. So with this knowledge in mind, let's move on to our spatial perspectives, where we ask, how much mining are people actually doing, and does it vary in intensity? And what factors influence this intensity, and can we predict it? Until now, mining in this region has only been tracked by initial deforestation. So when a forest that has not been mined is cleared for mining. And looking at that deforestation allows us to find the footprint of mining in our study area. For example, we have this map from my collaborator, Jorge. This map lets us know where mining is happening. It lets us see, for example, when mining enters a protected natural area, as it does here. It also lets us see how much land has been deforested from mining, but it does not actually capture all of the mining activity that happens in an area. As we learned from our conversations with locals, mined landscapes are not static. Miners can, and often do, return to a previously mined area. As we can see watching these previously abandoned mines in the red circle being revisited by miners. So if we want to look at actual mining activity, it's not enough to just get the footprint of when mining happens for the first time. Instead, we want to take the knowledge of where those deforestation events have occurred and use them to help us find where mining then happens for another time. And to do so, we need to look at much more subtle shifts in the vegetation, where we aren't going from an intact forest to a bare mining site, but instead we might be going from a patchy grassy field and then back to a mine. So to do this, I combine Jorge's map of the mining footprint, and then I construct annual composites of Landsat imagery from 1984 to 2020. I then take that Landsat data and determine each pixel's fractional cover by bare substrate, photosynthetic vegetation, and non-photosynthetic vegetation using ClassLight's Monte Carlo unmixing algorithm. And with these data combined, we can look at subtle shifts in the vegetation on previously mined areas to determine when they get mined again. And when we add all these times up, we find that miners tend to revisit old mines a lot. On average, we're finding that mine sites are visited about 3 or 4 times, with some being visited as many as 18 times. In fact, only a quarter of the mines included in our study were visited only once, which is massive when you think that these revisitation events have not been taken into account before. Until now, when we track mining activity, we only track deforestation, which means that we have been missing a lot of activity. Here you can see a plot showing the number of hectares deforested in blue and the number of hectares where mining is active shown in orange. When we take these revisitations into account, what we're finding is that mining activity in this region is 3 times higher than previously estimated. This difference between activity and deforestation is important, not just because it gives us a more complete view of mining intensity, but also because it allows us to look at how certain events may influence mining intensity. For example, we can look at what happens when the price of gold goes up, shown here in yellow, or when a major highway's construction is completed, shown here as a gray car. Likewise, we can also look at how changes in policy affect mining activity. For example, we can look at how intermittent military and police interdictions, shown here under this black bar, showed little to no changes in mining activity, whereas Peru's latest and most effectively coordinated effort, known as Operation Mercury, and shown here with this green police officer, show a very large drop in mining activity. And while currently this Operation Mercury is simply one of command and control, and people have found that as soon as military or police presence are reduced, mining immediately re-intensifies, so it's not a sustainable policy for the long term. But what it does do is it puts Peru in a very good position to design and implement policy that allows for miners to start up again in a way that is legal and economically beneficial for them, while also operating in a way that is beneficial for the environment. We can also take this data on mining visitations or occurrences and look at what factors may influence it, and then see if those factors can help us predict it. So let's talk about just a few factors that we looked at, since there are many and time is limited. So we looked at factors related to the ease of access to the mines. We know from the literature that access, such as distance to the river, can influence mining activity. So we looked at how far away from a primary or secondary river, shown here in blue, our mine sites were. And when we look at the partial dependency plot below, which shows how predicted visits change as we get further away from a river, we can see the magnitude of the effect that this factor has on visitation, where in this case, it looks that like visits go down as you get further from a river. Likewise, from our conversations with miners, that knowledge that an area may have gold, as indicated, for example, by being near another mine, might influence their decision to mine, we created this map where each green pixel represents a mine site, and the area of all adjacent pixels represents how large each mine aggregate is. The distance between them represents how far away from one another from another aggregated mine area any given mine is. And again, when we look at our partial dependency plot, we see that aggregates that are close together are visited much more than those that are at intermediate distances from one another. And then those that are very far apart tend to get a few more visits. Some other things we looked at to see how they influence mining intensity were a mine's designation and method. So with designation, we considered if land was designated for protection only, such as being in a natural area, a natural protected area, such as those in pink, or in an indigenous community, such as those in blue. And we looked at if a mine was in an informally declared mining concession, which is marked here in green. And then finally, we looked to see if a mine was in neither of these, or if it was in both of these, for example, when mining occurs in a concession declared by an indigenous community within their own territory. And what we found when we look at the partial dependency plot is that lands designated as concession or nothing are more intensely visited than mines that are in protected areas. And surprisingly, mines that are in overlapping designation are visited the most. And we also look at mining method, comparing this heavily or minimally mechanized types of mining, and find that heavily mechanized mines tend to be more active than minimally mechanized mines. And when we put our revisitation data and our candidate predictor variables into a random forest regression, we find that we can use those factors to predict how many visits an area will get with about 70% accuracy. Now, this is huge because it means that if we get a new mine site pop up in one of these three circles, for example, we can use our model to predict how intensely visited that site will be in the future. And this can be helpful for things such as policy design and prioritizing areas to designate for legal mining. And it can also be used for resource allocation. For example, for groups like my partner organization, Cincia, which go out and manually reforest abandoned mines, it can be helpful to know if that mine is likely to be visited again, so they don't waste time and money reforesting a site that will only be cleared and mined again. So let's review. What have we learned so far? Our current methods of tracking gold mining activity and policy intervention efficacy are missing a large part of the picture. Mining revisitation makes up a lot of mining activity, and it is influenced by multiple factors. We can predict this revisitation intensity by taking these factors into account, and we can use this understanding of revisitation, hopefully, to help design management policy and to direct resources more efficiently. Finally, we can go into our ecological perspectives on gold mining. Here, we wanted to find out if abandoned mines can naturally recover. When we speak with scientists, they tell us no, not at all, or maybe a couple pioneer species. And when we speak with miners and farmers and others that are local, they say that they do to some extent, or they completely reforest. So what we want to do is sort of see for ourselves which one is right, or if there's a middle ground here. And then if we find that mines can recover, we want to look at how the different mining methods we learned about and see if they have a different effect on natural recovery. So one way we can do this is to find a patch of forest, cut it down and mine it, and then just wait a couple decades and see what it looks like. Will it look like the scarred and barren landscape that so many other scientists told me it would? Or would the forest come back, at least to some extent, like so many interviewees told us it would? Another way to do this, rather than looking at the same space over time and then becoming the world's oldest PhD student, would be to look at different mine spaces that have been abandoned for different amounts of time and compare them to each other and to unmined forests. When we do this, it is called a chronosequence. And to do this, we first need to know how long a mine has been abandoned for, which we can find through the remotely sensed data. And here we can consider these years since last visit as the abandonment age of a mine. So I lumped these ranges of abandonment ages, I lumped these into ranges of abandonment ages to define my chronosequence. And I used this to help find candidate study sites and then selected study sites to sample based on, first and foremost, safety and accessibility. So I could only visit a mine site that wasn't currently in use because I'm studying abandonment, and also because mining is illegal and therefore miners are not going to take too kindly to me just showing up and trying to take some samples. And unfortunately, most of these mine sites are close to sites that are currently being mined. So I could only go to areas where the miners there already had a relationship with Cincia, or to areas where the communities were willing to grant me permission to enter and perform my work. These sites needed to be easily accessible by road or by boat so that I didn't have to walk through a different mine in order to get to where I actually had permission to work. These mine sites also needed to actually contain my chronosequence of interest so I could collect samples across all 4 time points. And I needed to be able to speak with miners with the long-standing knowledge of the site to make sure that the abandonment times I estimated were correct and that we could know what methods had been practiced there. So as you can see, we had lots of restrictions to finding sampling sites. And when all was said and done and our requirements were met, we were able to sample 6 chronosequences on heavily mechanized sites and 6 on minimally mechanized sites. For the minimally mechanized sites, we only visited sites that were on informal mining concessions and where no remediation had been practiced. For heavily mechanized sites, we were only able to visit sites that were operated by indigenous communities in their own concessions. And likely, because of this ownership they had of their land, they all practiced basic remediation on every mine we sampled that was over 10 years old. This remediation, again, includes leveling the mine site so that it's flat, and then returning previously removed topsoil to a mine. Here is an example of a representative chronosequence from each mine type that we sampled. So just walking around on these mines, we can see drastic changes in the soil and vegetation over time. At this earliest stage of abandonment, 0 to 4 years, both sites are barren and completely dominated by sand to the point where they feel like a very sad beach. By our next time point, these sites have revegetated to a greater extent than any we found on a heavily mechanized site. This soil was also largely still dry and sandy, while on these minimally mechanized sites, it had already started to retain some moisture and look a little bit less sandy. By 10 to 14 years, however, this revegetation process seems to swap. And heavy sites are starting to look a little bit better than those minimally mechanized sites. And this seems to coincide with the time that miners rehabilitated the soil at these heavy sites, which is indicated by this little hand here. So I look a little closer at the vegetation on these sites and analyze how much cover different vegetation types had in unmined forests and our mined sites. Here you can see in dark green foliar cover, so how much area on the ground is covered by the leaves and extent of woody plants, meaning trees or shrubs. And in light green, we have the foliar cover by herbaceous plants, which in our case is largely grass. And in brown, we have cover by bare ground. All you have to understand here is that in a disturbed tropical forest, more trees equals good and is largely associated with a recovering forest. And more grass or bare cover equals bad and is largely associated with a degraded tropical landscape. And what you can see is how these vegetation types change over abandonment time, which is here on the x-axis, compared to reference forest sites. And what we find is that in the beginning, our minimally mechanized sites tend to have a bit more tree cover than our heavy sites, but that seems to switch at the 10-year mark when tree cover in our heavily mechanized sites seems to really jump. Now, if these lines are a little difficult for you to understand, perhaps you will prefer to look at these lines. So here we're plotting the dissimilarity between the overall vegetation community structure. So the combination of all that tree, grass, and bare cover on a mine site when it's compared to its nearest unmined forest site. So basically anything higher on this dissimilarity index is more different from a forest, AKA less good, and anything lower is less dissimilar from a forest, AKA more good. And again, what we see is that minimally mechanized sites appear to be slightly less different from forests than heavies are until that remediation happens and heavies seem to get a little bit of a leg up on the competition. But remember for a moment what a mine looks like. It is not homogeneous, and rather it features 3 unique cover types. The tailings, which are composed largely of the sand that passes through the sluice box when miners are working. These make up the majority of the mine sites in our study and are what we have been referring to until now as the mine. But we also have these mound cover types, which are made up of the rocks that pile up at the base of these sluice boxes. Surprisingly to us, these actually seem to revegetate the most quickly and have the nicest seeming soil of all the cover types we looked at. This may be because the soil in the mounds has never actually been filtered by the sluice box and instead is the unfiltered forest soil that was already attached to the rocks when mining began. But it might also be because these rocks shade the soil that's within them. On the tailings, we have these wide open sandy beaches being directly beaten down upon by the sun, whereas in the mounds, the rocks shade that soil and allow it to stay cooler and hold on to moisture, making it easier for plants to grow. And another reason that these cover types seem to revegetate the most quickly is actually because of something the miners themselves do. You can see in this image that the miners use sticks to prop up these sluice boxes. These sticks are actually freshly cut saplings from nearby forests, and these saplings are still alive. So once they're put into the mounds, they start to just grow right there, which is why we can see trees growing out of mounds even after just a few months of abandonment. And at the other end of this cover type spectrum, we have these ponds that are formed by the excavating action of the suction pump. So these are filled with, as you can imagine, super waterlogged soil that's pretty much all silt and clay. They also often have a lot more mercury than other cover types because sometimes miners process their soil with mercury in the ponds and lose excess mercury to them. And what we see in the field is that these pond cover types tend to look the worst of all. Even by later stages of abandonment, they still have little to no vegetation. And when we look at the differences in vegetation community structure on these cover types compared to nearby forests, you can see that similarly to what we observed in the field, ponds are the most different from our reference forests at all abandonment ages, while mounds are the least and tailings are at a somewhat intermediate level. So these observations are all well and good, but to add a little context to this revegetation story, we wanted to quite literally dig a little deeper and analyze changes in soil biogeochemistry on mine soils over time. Soil forms the foundation of a forest ecosystem, and thus indicators of soil health can serve as a useful proxy for a system's ability to support vegetation. So we collected aggregate soil samples to assess the concentration of different nutrients as well as mercury in the soil, and to look at how soil microbial communities are changing on these mines. And we also look at some of the physical aspects of the soil, such as its moisture and texture. So when we take these soils, bring them back to the lab, and work our science magic on them, what do we find when we put it all together? So what we have found is when we look at these mines in these early stages of abandonment, they're largely unrecovered. They're hot and dry thanks to the lack of a canopy. The soil is highly dominated by sand, and vegetation is either absent or just present in the form of grass. Bacteria are also more diverse there. And as abandonment time elapses, and we look at mines in these later stages of abandonment, we find that fungal diversity is increasing along with soil nutrients and moisture, and this is paralleled by increases in tree cover. We also find that mercury is increasing, which may seem surprising until you realize that at younger sites with all their sand, they don't really have much in the soil to hold on to that mercury. So it actually leaves that system rather quickly. Whereas at these older sites, which have plenty of silt and clay and organic matter, they're able to hold on to the mercury that gets deposited there. And when we look closer at what's happening in the microbial communities, which are intricately linked to what's happening in both the soil and the vegetation, we find that the communities in these younger, more degraded mined areas are highly associated with tolerating stressful conditions, such as very high heat. We also find species that are associated with grass, which is some of the only vegetation there, as well as species associated with tolerating low nutrient environments, such as nitrogen fixers. And when we look at these older mines, which are less degraded and have gotten forest cover and soil nutrition back, we find many bacteria and fungi that have mutualistic associations with trees or are involved in decomposition. We also find, probably because of these higher mercury levels, more species that are known to tolerate heavy metals and are typically found in old mines. All right, so that's a lot to digest and figure out what it means. So allow me to do that for you. When we combine everything we've measured in the soil, we're able to calculate a soil health index that represents the overall health of the soil on the mines we visited. Here on the y-axis, you can see the soil health index values, and on the x, you can see the mining abandonment ages as well as the reference forests. In green, we show the soil health values that we found at forested sites. And we use these long green bars to indicate that range while we're comparing our mine samples to it. Now, when we do so, what we find is that first looking at just the overall mines, so in this case, the tailings, minimally mechanized sites are doing a little bit better than heavily mechanized sites at these earlier abandonment periods. But by 10 to 14 years, which again is when remediation happens at our heavily mechanized sites, we're seeing that switch where heavy sites seem to really get a soil health power boost. Now, when we look at our different cover types again, we see that just as they look the best in the field, the mounds also have the highest soil health over all times, and even get higher than what we're seeing in the forest at times. Ponds, on the other hand, they start out bad and they basically stay bad. And again, while these two cover types make up the minority of our mine sites, this is an important finding to note because while overall our heavily mechanized sites look pretty good, that may be due only to the remediation efforts that miners practice there. The majority of miners in this region that are using heavy machinery are not practicing these remediation efforts. And so instead, most of their abandoned heavy sites are typically more dominated by ponds than by tailings or by mounds, which we'll recall do the worst out of all the cover types we looked at. So future studies should definitely look at how the long-term recovery potential of mines is complicated by the continued presence of ponds. So what have we learned? Left to their own devices, mines do seem to recover their soil health, which is paralleled by vegetation changes. it appears that impacts vary by mining method used and remediation techniques can improve environmental outcomes. While we only looked at a few soil health and vegetation health indicators, we don't know much about what the long-term recovery of forests is, as we haven't looked at things like overall biomass or diversity changes, and we haven't looked at longer-term factors that affect soil health, such as soil carbon storage. And future studies should also look at mine sites that are dominated by pond cover types. So now, to wrap it all up, let's bring these three pieces back together and discuss what we've learned and how this may help provide a perspective for the future. So some of what we found is that mining is not going anywhere. Its uncertain legal status complicates the potential for improvement. Revisitation by miners is frequent and predictable, and mines can recover to some extent on their own, but pond-dominated mines may struggle. And how we move forward. First, obviously, we share our results with local communities and agencies and recommend that they incorporate local perspectives into their policy design, consider revisitation when monitoring and predicting mining activity, and consider natural recovery potential in policy design. And hopefully, this information, combined with the massive amounts of work that many others are doing on the ground, can lead us to a better future for mining in the area, one where we keep in mind that the miners are the ones that are going to make the real change. While the miner does not feel the rewards, he is not going to do it. So you work with him to get a solution. Thank you very much. That's it for me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rachel. So we already have some questions in the queue. So I'm going to start with just reading out one question because somebody posted this anonymously. The question is, wouldn't the ideal mining intervention then be minimal mechanization and remediation? Is that possible? So that's one question. And then the second question is, separately, in reality, how often do previously mined lands remain undisturbed for more than 15 years?
Okay, so I'll do the first one first, and I'll hopefully remember the second one. So for the minimally mechanized mines, while they're disturbing the soil less, it's actually way harder to remediate the soil by, leveling that topography and adding back topsoil, because these people are working by hand. So they would have to literally go out with shovels and try and flatten all those mounds, fill in all those ponds, and then manually walk soil back and forth from forests into those mines. So the heavy equipment, even though it is more disturbing to the system, it actually makes it possible for miners to put in that little bit of extra effort to try and remediate it. I forgot the second question.
I totally understand. Let me ask it. So how often do previously mined lands remain undisturbed for more than 15 years?
Yeah. Well, not that often, because we found that revisitation is a really big part of this piece. But obviously it does happen, as we also found sites that we could sample. But the hope is that as the people living and working in Peru and the government work together to sort of make policies that can legalize mining, they might be able to designate areas that allow mining to happen, and we sort of give those areas to the miners to work. And then the other sites that had been worked before will be allowed to rest in peace and hopefully naturally recover on their own. So that's kind of the perspective that those findings hopefully provide for that.
Okay, wonderful. So our next question comes from Tim. And Tim, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure, thank you very much. Fascinating presentation, and I really appreciate this incredible work that you've done, Rachel. So my question is actually pretty narrow and focused on one of your last comments, and that is, you mentioned that soil carbon is an is an important issue to try to better understand in the remediation of these sites. I guess my question to you is, how important is that in the context of all of the other things that are important too? So I'm trying to get a sense of why that came up at the very end and how important is it? So thank you.
Okay, thanks Tim for tuning in. It probably came up at the very end because I meant to say it earlier and forgot. Um, and so soil carbon is super important in these systems because there's actually more carbon being stored in the soils than in the forests themselves. So obviously the long-term carbon future of these systems is really important. And I wasn't able to look at that. So hopefully future studies where people are working on how to sort of get these degraded mines to, or degraded lands in general, to sort of increase their carbon storage potential will come in handy. And it also points out that, this soil health that I've looked at, it's not, the be all and end all perspective of what soil health is. It's just the perspective of the soil health metrics that I looked at. So just like someone can have the flu and also chickenpox, and we only check chickenpox and they recover, we might say they're recovered, but they still have the flu. So it's just sort of pointing out that, this soil health is not, everyone gets a free pass to mine. It's just sort of, there is a hopeful future for mining.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Tim. Okay, so I'm going to read a question and I'm going to read the name of a location and I'm going to totally butcher this. So I apologize. And Rachel, perhaps you can correct me after I've butchered it. The question is, since most heavily mechanized sites are located in historic mining settlements, so for more than 40 years of mining, like in Hoipetehu, where there is a long legacy of mining, do you think that over time these forests will recover at the same rate with no remediation as the minimally mechanized sites?
That's a great question. I'm going to guess it's someone that works with Cynthia that asked it. So I definitely don't think that that's going to be the case in these frequently and heavily mined sites, like what we find in Hoipetehu, because repeated disturbance obviously can have, play a big role in recovery potential. And these sites, they're massive. They make up a big part of the mining footprint. So obviously we need to focus on them in the future. At the time that I was doing these studies, it was not very safe to go to those sites and sample there. So I wasn't able to look at that to specifically ask that question that I was also curious about. But I definitely think it's safe to assume that the recovery timeline will be a lot different on those frequently mined sites. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. Okay, so we have another question. What was it like working with local communities? Was it difficult to gain their trust?
Yeah, I think that's kind of the case when you work with any community. But especially so here where, I'm clearly an outsider and a lot of these people are engaging in activities that are not necessarily legal. A big help that we had was that, I had lived in Peru for a year beforehand. So I already had a lot of friends working in this area that were from this area, and was able to get, personally introduced to people that way. And I also spent some months working with farmers in this area, and most of those farmers either had family or were miners themselves. So those were great for personal introductions. And then we also, because we were partnered with Cynthia, we also got a huge leg up on meeting a lot of different mining communities that we never would have had access to before. And that was because they had been spending, the many years of hard work going out and talking to these communities regularly.
Great. And just to follow up with that, I would like to invite Michael to ask his question.
Yes, I just want to know if you retain any contact with any constituents from your study.
Hi, Mike. Thanks for coming. Yeah, I'm obviously in contact with Cynthia. I've also been in contact with a lot of the people that were, so generous with their time in talking to me and allowing us to go and visit their sites and sharing some of these preliminary results. And the thing that I'm like very jazzed for and working on now is making sure that all these results are well summarized for to give both to these communities and to our partners there.
Wonderful. And I think you're getting so many great questions along these lines. There was a great question about what is your best mining story? But I think we probably have time just for maybe one more question. And I'd like to invite Caitlin to ask her question.
Hi, thanks for the great talk. I thought it was really interesting to hear the perspective of the miners on the health effects of mercury. And I'm curious if you know of any studies in this particular region on either humans or wildlife that are detecting negative health impacts of mercury exposure.
Yeah, dozens. I think I haven't looked at the participants yet, but I'm sure that many people that actually study those questions are online right now. A lot of the miners that we spoke to, and also a lot of the farmers, I mean, they have a personal investment in not believing in this sort of bad health story because they're the ones working with mercury, and in the case of the farmers, they're the ones trying to sell their crops to people and convince them that they don't have mercury in them. But there are study after study looking at fish and other wildlife and looking at communities both within these mining regions as well as in, for example, indigenous tribes that are very far downriver from mining and finding that their mercury levels are much higher than what would be considered a safe level. And there are lots of psychology and health studies looking into some of the health impacts that they have. And I can definitely email you some of those authors to check out or some of those papers if you want, Caitlin.
Hey, oh, we just ticked over to 3:25. I was going to see if we can squeeze in one more question. However, I want to keep us on time. So Rachel, I'd like to turn it over to you and for the acknowledgements. And I'd like to thank everyone for asking such wonderful questions. There are still some questions in the queue, and Rachel, you will have the opportunity to take a look at those later.
Great. I want to again thank all of you that came out today. I know you didn't have to travel very far, but I really appreciate you logging in and listening to me babble. I also, I really want to thank my dissertation committee, Alex and Gabrielle. You both came on kind of at the last minute and really helped me out a lot. Greg, your research was the reason I came to Stanford in the first place, and it's just been so amazing to see what good science can accomplish in the real world. Kabir, you've been such a wonderful mentor to me, not just because you helped me figure out what kind of mushrooms I can grow when trees fall down by my house, but also just through supporting me with all of this lab work and all of this sort of intellectual development that comes with learning how to work with these large data sets. Miles, it's been an absolute dream to work with you. I only knew you really through your work on tropical ecology before starting this PhD, and getting the chance to work with you has been great. You've been just really supportive and really positive, and you definitely made me feel really good about myself and my studies when I needed to. And Scott, I can pretty much say almost the same, except with soil. I'd come into this program having only ever looked at plants, and you made something as sort of out there as soil carbon or cation exchange capacity seem tenable. And, you really helped me figure out how to take these complex concepts and make them into something manageable like a soil health index. I obviously, of course, really want to thank E-IPER leadership and staff, especially, Anne-Marie has been kind of my guardian angel these past few months. And everyone has just been so helpful. My collaborators and colleagues and others that I worked in Peru. There's far too many to say by name, but I'm so grateful for everyone that helped me and worked with me and taught me so much. And I'm so grateful for the communities that allowed us to come in there and allowed us to learn from them. And of course, everyone else that works at CINCIA, since there's so many to name. And my collaborators and colleagues at Stanford and beyond. I'm so grateful to everybody that's been able to help me either with statistics or with figuring out how to get my grant checks into the Stanford system. I'm especially thankful to everyone in the Asner lab, in the Carnegie Department of Global Ecology, in the E-IPER program, in the Fendorf lab and the Peay lab and the Silman lab. And I really want to thank the previous mentors that I had, especially at the Museum of Natural History, but at Groningen and Montpellier and beyond. Working with you really made me feel like being a scientist was something I could do. And I'm so grateful for those experiences. I also want to acknowledge and thank all the organizations and centers that helped me with funding this work or making data accessible. CINCIA, of course, and Stanford and E-IPER, the Haas Center for Public Service, and then National Geographic, which funded the majority of this work, and Planet Labs, which helped us use a lot of data. On a more personal note, I'm so grateful for all of my friends, especially the ones that have signed on today. There's too many of you to call out by name, so I'll just do a big shout out to all of the incredible women in my PhD cohort and their partners and their children, all the incredible people that I got to learn with during my master's that really made me finally feel like I could make this bridge from molecular biology to ecology. And then, my two best friends, Brian and Jesse, who have been helpful for laughing and smiling along the way. Of course, my parents, I'm so grateful to my mom and dad. I'm, so sorry that my mom couldn't be alive for this, but I feel her, every day. And my sister, who's been my best friend and one of my biggest supports throughout this. And my little brother, baby G, and my stepmom, who also unfortunately passed away. But I was so grateful for the few years that I had her in my life. And most of all, I want to thank, the two biggest loves of my life, my partner, Spencer, and my dog, Mustache. I don't think I could have done any of this without your support and without Mustache's goofy tongue to cheer me up when I was getting frustrated with data. And last, I'm going to thank myself because I did all this work and there were a lot of times where I didn't think I was going to make it through, but I did. So I'm really grateful that I didn't quit when I thought I might. So thank you all again.